With only 3 vehicles to talk about in GT7 156, of course we were going to get to the end pretty quick, and as I mentioned before, I believe it was in my overarching thoughts for 1.56 last Thursday, I don't really care about the Z4 all that much. In fact, most of the Z cars don't do much for me. I like the Z1, it's quirky, but you don't really see that in many games, and even the Z8, it seems like the kind of thing I would usually love, but for whatever reason it seems a bit overrated. This one I am surprised, to be honest, that they went for the open top instead of the coupe. The coupe I would imagine would be a better received car, but of course there's no real way of knowing. If we do end up getting it down the line, I guess we'll have to wait and see. And if you were going to pick any Z car, aside from the Z8 already being in there, I think maybe the Z3M Coupe, known colloquially as the clown shoe, would probably be a fan favourite, I would imagine. But this one, as it turns out, really pleasantly surprised me to make up for its, in my opinion, fairly underwhelming overall package by having some really good modifications. Not only can you do stuff like upgrading the turbo, get way more horsepower out of it, but you can do some really good looking visual mods, as you can see here. Now when I say good looking, I know that a stanced vehicle isn't to everyone's taste, but I kind of wanted to showcase just how different you can make this car look. You can have a very interesting form-fitting rear wing on the back, you can have one which sticks out quite a bit more, almost like old school Zender kind of tuned cars from the 70s and 80s vibes and arts tuning and all that kind of stuff. The wide body is very wide on the case of this car, and personally, I don't know how you folks feel about this, I always prefer it when a wide body in Gran Turismo looks like an actual wide body in terms of being attached to the car, like Rocket Bunny style, instead of just a wider version of the same shape. I know that's very much a preference thing, but I like to see the effect of the wide body and for it to look like a racing edition, you know? Now, in the form of this one, I'm only running a fairly modest build in terms of performance, because I wanted to see what it could do more so as like a grip build or a cornering car, and take on some supercars and hypercars to see what it's like at that level. Kind of a TVR, but with a German twist, which I guess is technically a Wiesmann, but you know what I mean. So just over 300 horsepower, barely 1,000 kilos, and the weight being so low is so refreshing. It's crazy how this car doesn't really feel like it's that old. It's around 20 years old, which is insane, but it doesn't feel that old, and yet already vehicles are so much heavier for the most part these days than they were back then. And of course there are some valid reasons for that. They're bigger, they have hybrid systems, batteries, etc, is all getting bigger, but it feels weird how that time has passed so quickly of having lightweight vehicles. And even though there are some, it seems to be kind of a dying art now, and the Nissan GT-R was kind of the first to really push that, being a super heavy car that was still very, very fast, very forgiving through corners even, because all of that weight was actually about performance, which of course is the saving grace in many cases. In the case of this one though, well, I very deliberately said that it was a German TVR in its approach, because that really is how it feels. It's slightly more forgiving than a TVR. In fact, if you tune it in the way that I have here, it feels kind of like a TVR Tamora. Easy to use, it's more forgiving, but it still has that kind of low weight, high horsepower, relatively high horsepower approach, which a TVR always uses to its advantage. If you're going to tune something like a Z4, you should probably embrace that, because it's never going to be a top tier contender in terms of power, at least without a crazy engine swap, which it wouldn't surprise me if we got that down the line. And this thing with something like a V12 in it would be pretty awesome, although I don't see that happening. In future though, we'll have to wait and see. For now, this is what we've got to work with. And one of the things, again, which I mentioned in my initial review for the update, which I do quite like, and again, I think it's because I didn't expect it, is that you can have 3 distinctly different looks to the car in terms of actual versions of the Z4. So if you leave it standard, you've got that early model, as the car actually is, the gaping open shark kind of mouth on the front, but then you can do that subtle update with the fog lights and the grille. You can see it in the thumbnail of that review for 1.56, where it just looks like the kind of midlife update for the Z4. Then though, if you fit the wide body, like I have here, you can change the front end to the Z4M style version. In terms of what it's actually like to drive, well, it delivers pretty well. 230 or so horsepower, so this thing standard has the power of the fully tuned Unimog. In comparison, it only weighs 1,290 kilos anyway, so it's like hot hatch territory, or what used to be hot hatch territory, and 483 points is pretty modest, even when you build it up like I have here. It's still not crazy on points, and at 60 grand, well, it's the second cheapest one here. It's slightly cheaper than the Peugeot 205, which sounds insane when you put it that way, but of course in real life you probably could pick up a Z4 most of the time for less money than a Peugeot 205, certainly a good condition one, so that's pretty accurate. Maybe not this expensive, but it's accurate in comparison. Ultimately, there's not too much else to say about the car for me at least. It looks good, it sounds good, it performs very well. It just happens to be a car that in its standard form I don't have too much interest in. I totally get why people do, and I'm sure I'd love to drive one if I actually did, because Beamers usually end up like that for me when I drive them in real life. I'm not too interested, then when I drive it, I find myself kind of liking it a lot. Moving later on this week, speaking of reviewing BMWs, BMWs though, well, you might want to stick around, because Beards and Cars is back on Wednesday and I'm reviewing another real-world BMW, but something very different to this one, and funnily enough, something quicker than this one as well, despite its size. But that's it for GT7, I'll see you next time with Beards and Cars, and of course beyond, and thanks for watching.